Yes, that's right, Linda. The possibility of sanctions and of imposition of sanctions on Kenya over the International Criminal Court issue has had Kenya's diplomatic relations in a spin and in sharp focus. But have we really digested what sanctions really are? Now, sanctions are penalties imposed on private individuals, government officials, governments or groups of governments, and the purpose of sanctions is to persuade the change of a policy specific to a nation or to desist from pursuing a specific policy. For example, North Korea's development of a nuclear warhead has been in the news recently, and that has the United Nations considering extending sanctions against that nation. Now, another purpose is to punish crimes committed that have international implications. Now, so who enforces the sanctions? At the international level, like in the case of North Korea, the UN Security Council has the power to impose sanctions on member states that have not abided by the international laws or whose actions locally have negative international implications. Regional federations as well as individual states can also impose sanctions on one another. Now, individual states as well, like I had mentioned, can impose sanctions on one another. But in Kenya's case, has Kenya ever endured sanctions before? The answer is yes. If there are people who are a little older than me, they'll know this particularly well. In the 90s, economic sanctions were imposed on Kenya to force political reform as well as the liberalization of the economy. But in 2011, this is more recent, this was in the news a little more recently, the United States sanctioned immediate former Kilome MP John Harun Mwau over his alleged role in international drug trafficking, freezing all of his assets in the United States. Now, does Kenya risk sanctions? That's a question that is being thought about today, and the answer is yes. If the government refuses to cooperate with the ICC, that could trigger sanctions in a certain way. If the ICC refers that to United Nations Security Council, and the United Nations Security Council therefore decides to impose sanctions. But also if the suspected persons refuse to cooperate with the ICC process, that can also trigger sanctions on them personally. For instance, like the person in Africa, I think the only person in Africa whom sanctions have been imposed as a result of an action triggered by the ICC, Omar al-Bashir, we all know him, Sudan's president, was here during 2007 during the promulgation of our constitution. He has had sanctions imposed on him over his refusal to honor ICC summons. Now, the subject of Kenya's international standing has caused some blowback to envoys in Kenya. Now, one of those is Swiss ambassador to Kenya, Jacques Pitlu. I spoke with him earlier today and started by asking him whether Switzerland was backing any particular candidate in the upcoming election.
Preferred candidate. We are not going to interfere with the choice of the Kenyan people. What I also said is that for Switzerland, compliance with the Statute of Rome is of the essence, meaning that in case of non-compliance, Switzerland will have no choice but to apply its own legal obligations, and we will be in a legal situation and not a political one.
What in specific are those obligations that you believe might be impinged on Switzerland?
So first of all, one has to see clearly that it will not be for Switzerland or for any country to decide whether Kenya is in compliance or not. It's a court decision. ICC will determine whether Kenya is complying or not. If not, then it will be for the ICC to appeal to the Security Council, and then for the Security Council to decide on what measures to take. Which means that we will be caught in a legal maze where we as countries do not have any influence on the decisions taken. But once they are taken, we have to comply. So it's much too early to speculate about what the Security Council might decide in such a situation. But knowing of the examples of other countries, we can imagine more or less what it could be.
Say the international community, the UN Security Council, decides to impose economic sanctions because of a policy adopted by government not to abide by the Rome Statute and Kenya's obligations. Where does Switzerland fit in all of this?
Switzerland fits into this in the sense that Switzerland will apply any sanctions decided by the Security Council. We always do, and will always did, and we always will do. If there are financial sanctions, it will mean that every financial financial transaction with Kenya will be subject to a lot of scrutiny, just to make sure that it does not implicate any people connected to the economic interests of the ICC inductees. It's quite a nightmare, financially speaking.
Let's just explore that nightmare a little bit. Say someone of the stature of the president has personal sanctions imposed against him. Does that mean that the financial transactions of the president alone are liable to that kind of scrutiny?
It means that a financial institute dealing with Kenya will have to go through a very painful process of due diligence to make sure that any transaction they are making with Kenya is not related to the economic interests of whoever it is who is an ICC indictee in non-compliance. In our experience from other situations around the world, any person or company suspected of being a front person or a front company will be, of course, subject to the same scrutiny.
The proponents of let Kenyans decide and the rest will follow say that geopolitically Kenya is so important that the West cannot. These are really just empty threats. That the West and by extension the UN Security Council's decisions with regard to Kenya cannot really be followed up because Kenya is important to Somalia, it's important to Rwanda in terms of trade, it's important to Uganda, it's important to Tanzania, and thereby the interests of various Western nations. Do you think that really is true? Is Kenya up on that kind of a pedestal?
The fact is that in our own experience, much larger countries in terms of their economies who have been subjected to sanctions were in fact subjected to the sanctions, and there was no decision to forget about it just because they were important.
But the real politic of international relations often is that there is an overriding national interest. Say, let's use your example. Say, and this is hypothetical. Say Switzerland had an overriding national interest that had to do with Kenya. Even after sanctions were imposed, we've seen this in the past with the countries still having very
and you know,
relations.
I have to state clearly, our overriding national interests are defined in our constitution. And because Switzerland is a small country, we put a very, very strong emphasis on the respect of international law, because international law is here to protect the weak, not to protect the big ones. And we consider the respect of international law as a strategic interest of Switzerland.
What do you make of the statements of various candidates that in the event of the outcome of an election that is, and there are a number of caveats, free and fair, democratically accepted, that they would concede? Do you think that that's a statement that's hung on very specific outcomes? The judiciary, for instance, is a very important part of this outcome, because the last time there was the impression that was created that the judiciary could not be trusted with handling electoral disputes. Do you think that our judiciary is now up to scratch in terms of the level of trust that it has with the public to handle electoral disputes and thereby forestall any sort of violence that would come out of those disputes?
We do believe that the candidates will stick to their word. We know they will stick to their word, and they will go through the legal process if there is any discussion about the results, and go to the courts, not to the streets.